Doamnelor, domnilor, bun găsit! Sunt Ovidiu Mihăiuc. Vă invit să urmăriți continuarea interviului pe care l-am făcut săptămâna trecută cu istoricul Eric Storm, profesor la Universitatea Leiden. Vorbim despre o carte despre naționalism, naționalismul, o istorie globală. Nationalism inspired both movements of autocratic regimes and democratic regimes. What do you think about what determines which directions it takes?
So what we see that even very autocratic regimes nowadays, there is a constitution, there is a parliament, there are elections, but they are manipulated. So even in Putin's Russia, there is a parliament, there are elections, but everyone knows these elections are not really fair. And the only one who decides is Putin. But Putin even decides to maintain this facade of of popular sovereignty, of elections, of a constitution. The same we see in other dictatorships. But what we also see is that we have seen it quite a lot the last few years, is that if a regime does not really serve the nation, does not really serve the citizens, people rise up. We have seen it in Bangladesh, we have seen it in Syria, we have seen it in, I think, in various parts of Latin America recently. We have seen it during the Arab Spring,
Yeah, exactly.
Iran nowadays. So the problem is that many regimes now are very strong, and so the Iranian regime really can resist the population, and if needed they kill a lot of protesters. And so the power of the people to really overthrow an autocratic regime is in many instances it's difficult, and so but the aspiration still is there, and the rhetoric from both sides is we serve the people, and if you do not serve the people can rise up.
Is there something inside nationalism that can turn dangerous?
Yes, well, I think in my book there are a lot of instances in which nationalism really has very tragic or fatal consequences. What I didn't know a lot about is, for instance, the fate of indigenous communities in the Americas. So they were excluded from citizenship, and in the United States there were treaties with these tribes of Native Americans, but they were not respected because these were not civilized nations, so there was no need to respect them. And so they were expelled, they were treated very badly. So in the United States, Native Americans only received citizenship in 1924. So very, very late, so just 100 years ago. And we see this also in Greenland, in Scandinavia, where the Sami were treated very badly. And so they were forced to go to, the children went to boarding schools, women were sterilized. So there was this kind of forced assimilation that really was very violent in a sense. And this also happened in Australia with the Aboriginals. So nationalism and nation building, so creating a kind of homogeneous national community, process of assimilation, can be very violent. And even in more homogeneous countries, imposing the national language as the civilized language was very negative for all kind of dialects. So many dialects disappeared because you had to speak the civilized standard language. So in the Netherlands, you were punished when you spoke dialect in school, and the official standard Dutch was called General Civilized Dutch. And so speaking dialect was seen as uncivilized. So you can also see this as a kind of cultural homogenization that was very negative for all kind of rural, local cultures, local dialects, which largely disappeared. You know.
Okay, we already speak about globalism and nationalism that are not so excluded, but many people believe globalization would weaken the national identities today. Instead, nationalism seems very present. Why do you think?
Yeah, for me a surprise was the post-war period, so the 1950s and 60s. So this is the period when the nation state really became hegemonic. So it is the period of decolonization. So it was the end of empires. All states became independent nation states. But instead of emphasizing national identities and national differences, what happened in the 1950s and 60s was this emphasis on modernization, on development. This happened in the communist countries, very heavy-handed, but also in all kind of independent African countries. So Egypt built the Aswan Dam, and so that a lot of ancient temples disappeared under the Aswan Dam was not a problem to Nasser. And it's only after international pressure that some of these ancient temples were saved. But he gave them away. So there are now several ancient Egyptian temples. For instance, there's one in the park in Madrid, which was a present by Nasser. So this concept of national heritage was not very important. And in Brazil, you had a politician who argued we're going to make a lot of progress in the coming years, and so he decided to build a new capital, Brasilia. Which really was a new town in the middle of the country, in the rainforest, and so all building materials were transported there by plane. And he built a highly modernist city with concrete, steel, and glass, and with straight roads. And these roads received numbers, not names. So the only thing that really referred to the country was the name of the capital, Brasilia. But the rest of it is very, you can find these kind of cities anywhere in the world. So in the 1950s and 60s, the world became much more homogeneous. And then when, from the 1970s onward, we see this process of globalization, it is also the rise of identity politics. And so the emphasis on national differences, on national identities. So in the 60s, when people spoke about identities, people said, go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so to speak about your own identity. But if we now speak about identity, it's about national identity. And this has become almost an obsession. So this really went hand in hand with globalization, yeah.
Also, you spoke about after the war, post-war period, and in 1979, something new has happened. Tell us about this.
Yeah,
this new current.
Yeah. So my chapters are chronological, mostly a period of 30, 40 years, and the turning points are quite obvious. So the First World War, the end of the Second World War, the French Revolution, but when I wrote the last chapters, initially I took 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the turning point, but it did not work. So I saw that many things that became prominent after 1989 had already started in the late 1970s and the 1980s. And so I found out that the crucial turning point is more 1979. So it's, on the one hand, it's the year that Margaret Thatcher was elected, and the next year Ronald Reagan. So it's the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism gained power and rapidly was spread throughout the world, also here after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in neoliberalism, economics is not an issue anymore. So economics should be left to the market. So this meant that political debate was not anymore on economic policy, on the redistribution of wealth, but it was on identity issues. So Reagan and Thatcher were very patriotic. They emphasized family values, so they were very conservative. So identity politics arose at the same time. And so identity politics and neoliberalism are kind of connected. And identity politics also started in 1979. So we see this most clearly in the case of religious identity. So 1979 is the year of the Iranian Revolution, so the rise of political Islam. It is also the year that in the United States evangelicals founded the moral majority movement, which had an enormous impact on the Republican Party, so focusing on conservative morals, so pro-life, pro-family, pro-nationalism. So they really had an identity politics for the United States. And it's also the time that Karol Wojtyła, the Pope. John Paul II was elected. Well, he was elected at the end of '78, so he even preceded this movement. But he also, the Catholic Church in the 1960s had been very progressive. So he made the Catholic Church, again, very conservative. And he emphasized conservative morals and had an enormous impact, especially on Poland, but also on other parts of East Central Europe. And it's also the time that Hindu nationalism arose again. So we see this is also, again, a global turning point where we see both neoliberalism and identity politics arise at the same time.
I and a lot of my friends were used to see the neoliberalism linked only by the economic issues, like the new neoliberalism in this way. But this was a good moment to think over. And do you think there are links between those moments after 1979 and then with I don't know, maybe Brexit and the Trump elections and what happens today?
Yeah, so well, we will speak about social media. I think they had an enormous impact as well.
We can start.
Yeah, but I also think that we had quite some crises. So we had the financial crisis in 2008. Maybe in Europe we also had the refugee crisis of 2015. Then we had the pandemic, and so it diminished the trust of large parts of the population in the state and in mainstream politics. And I think there is a kind of widespread dissatisfaction with how politics is, that the state is not anymore really serving the population. And so this, in a sense, undermined trust in mainstream political parties and made more radical options feasible for large parts of the electorate. Yeah.
Maybe in one sentence, if you can, is there a point where nationalism becomes incompatible with liberal democracy?
Yes, so liberal democracy also means the rule of law. And so if the law does apply only to some people and not to others, then there is no real liberal democracy anymore.
And do you believe it is possible to love your country and without embracing these values of nationalism?
I think it's with capitalism. So it's very hard to think of a world without capitalism. So how would it function? And so it is also extremely difficult to imagine a world without nation states. So if we think of the future, climate change probably will be the most important challenge for humanity. And I think nation states probably are not really the best way of organizing humanity to deal with climate change, because all national governments are elected by their own electorate. So international cooperation to deal with this problem is very difficult. And but how do we arrive at a different organization of the world? It is almost impossible. And you can think of alternatives, but there is no logical way how to arrive there. So I think we're stuck with the nation state for the future. And we can probably make the best of it and then support the one where you live in, but also understand that as human beings, we're all in the same boat. So you can say we should only serve the national interest, but if everyone does it, then there is no boat in which we're together and we're not progressing as a whole, as humankind.
We increasingly hear the term sovereignism in the late years, rather than nationalism. It is just a rebranding. How do you see it, or is or conceptually different?
Yeah. Well, I'm not very much in favor of it because this sovereign, you can be sovereign as a nation, but it really means that right is might in the end, because it's the big countries that have more power than the small ones. So I think we saw this very, very good in the case of Switzerland. So Switzerland is really a sovereign country. It is neutral. It does not want to be part of the European Union. And it was very happy and proud of its situation. But when Trump came, he decided to impose tariffs but the European Union received tariffs of only 15%, but Switzerland received 39%. So if you're a small sovereign nation, you're not very powerful in this situation. So in the unstable geopolitical situation we're in right now, being sovereign, being on your own, like Great Britain after the Brexit, does not really improve your situation. I think nowadays the European Union really helps us to survive in this very difficult and probably also chaotic international situation that we are arriving at the moment. And yeah, so if you focus on your own sovereignty, you can be very sovereign but very powerless in this difficult geopolitical situation.
Okay, we have some minutes left from our interview. How do you think the social media platforms impact with nationalism, change the way the nationalism is perceived, spread and mobilized and mobilize people?
Yeah. So these are companies. Facebook,
big tech.
Big tech. So they want to earn money, and so they want you to be glued to the screen as much time as possible. And so they achieve this by stimulating radical messages, clickbait, so that people really click on the next item. And so internet stimulates radical opinions rather than mainstream opinions. And so racism, xenophobia, you're immediately curious if you see such a radical opinion. And if you just see a very moderate mainstream opinion, it is not very attractive. So news about climate change, nobody reads them because it's a slow process. It's not a catastrophe. It is it is interesting and it's important, but it's not very attractive. So everybody reads these stories and these radical opinions. So it has very clearly a very radicalizing impact on nationalism, on xenophobia, and so it in a way undermines the existing political system.
Professor Storm, a last question, please. In the 19th century, nationalism was spread by newspapers, by books, through schools. Do you think social media today playing a similar role in?
Yeah, so in a sense, social media can also connect you to other people, but it can bring people together. And in the beginning we thought it would be a global village where we meet all in peace and harmony, but what we see really is this radicalizing impact of social media. And sometimes I think we're now heading into a new age with artificial intelligence, so social media become even less trustworthy because you can make videos, you can make images. It becomes much harder to distinguish fake from true. So probably there is a renaissance of traditional media because at least you're paid to check your sources, and also. But this is I'm not an expert, but I think ChatGPT and so they need trustworthy information as well. So if you ask a question to ChatGPT and you get a false answer, you will be angry. So artificial intelligence probably brings back the focus on the mainstream, on true information, on scientific information. So probably we're heading into a different period, but the problem is artificial intelligence, it's again big corporations that are behind it. So it's this commercial logic. So probably we should not be too optimistic about that either. Yeah.
Professor Storm, thank you so much for this conversation about your book, Nationalism, Global History. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Doamnelor și domnilor, vă mulțumesc și dumneavoastră că ne-ați urmărit în acest dialog despre naționalism, despre cum a apărut, despre legăturile sale cu globalizarea sau de asemenea cu suveranismul, așa cum îl știm în zilele noastre că se manifestă. Sunt Ovidiu Mihăiuc. La revedere!